10 Golden Age Hollywood Stars Who Were the Dumbest. The golden glow of old Hollywood promised perfection. On screen, its stars looked like gods and goddesses, flawless faces, glittering talent, and the kind of refinement that left audiences in awe. But behind the dazzling lights and carefully scripted interviews, the truth was far less glamorous. Some of the most beloved legends of the silver screen were shockingly short on intelligence and common sense. The studio system didn't care about sharp minds, it cared about beauty. Casting directors openly admitted it: we didn't want thinkers. We wanted pretty faces who would follow orders. In fact, brains were considered a liability. A curious mind asked questions, pushed back, and complicated control. What the studios needed were stars who looked perfect and obeyed without hesitation. Today, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on 10 icons whose intellectual shortcomings were carefully hidden from the public. From actors who couldn't remember their own lines to legends who made disastrous financial choices, these stories reveal the wide, and often shocking, gap between Hollywood's golden image and the messy reality. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler with an empty scabbard. On screen, he was the very picture of charm and daring, dazzling audiences in Captain Blood and the Adventures of Robin Hood. His heroes always thought fast, fenced sharp, and delivered lines with razor wit. But off-screen, the truth was almost laughably opposite. A Warner Brothers script supervisor once confided, Flynn was stunningly ignorant about almost everything. He couldn't even point out Europe on a map. And this wasn't exaggeration. Born in Tasmania, raised partly in England, and later hailed in Hollywood, Flynn's education had been a string of expulsions. He never graduated, and worse, he never cared to make up for it. Intellectual curiosity simply wasn't in his arsenal. Director Michael Curtiz, who guided Flynn through some of his biggest hits, became infamous for dumbing down Flynn's dialogue. A Warner Brothers writer revealed, Curtiz cut out any word over 2 syllables, not because Flynn couldn't pronounce them, but because he rarely understood what he was saying. This lack of comprehension often wrecked filming. Flynn would emphasize the wrong word in a line, forcing endless retakes. One soundman recalled, he'd stress the instead of the key word. He wasn't reading for meaning, he was just spitting out words. Even Flynn's autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, had to be ghostwritten. The writer later admitted, I'd interview Flynn for hours, then stitch together his rambling stories into something coherent. Half the time, he didn't even remember his own anecdotes. And the irony? The man who played quick-thinking geniuses could barely sort out basic geography. One infamous story claims Flynn once asked if New York was in California, then reversed the question when corrected. On screen, he was the clever rogue who always had the last word. Off-screen, he was a man lost for words. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis was Hollywood's golden boy, handsome, charming, and magnetic on screen. But behind the dazzling smile and matinee idol looks, Curtis carried a reputation that left insiders shaking their heads. He could memorize a page of dialogue flawlessly, deliver it with passion, and then turn to his director asking, "What did I just say?" One filmmaker compared him to a parrot, brilliant at repeating words, but not always grasping their meaning. Curtis's formal education ended when he dropped out of high school, and it showed in surprising ways. On the set of The Vikings, he once asked Kirk Douglas if Vikings were real or just fantasy creatures like dragons. When Douglas realized he wasn't joking, he started giving Curtis history lessons between takes. Years later, during the Great Race, Curtis kept asking which highways they would take to drive from America to France, forcing director Blake Edwards to explain, again and again, that they'd have to cross the ocean. His innocence wasn't limited to history or geography. During a USO tour, Curtis famously asked if Japan was part of China, and when told it wasn't, followed up by asking if China was part of Japan. Financially, his decisions were just as baffling. Despite earning millions, he poured money into reckless schemes. One manager recalled Curtis sinking $50,000 into a plan to import sand to Hawaii, because someone at a party told him the islands were running out of beaches. And yet, Curtis thrived. His natural charisma, his emotional vulnerability, and his uncanny ability to connect with audiences made him a star. He may not have understood every line he spoke, or every deal he signed, but when the cameras rolled, Tony Curtis embodied the kind of movie magic that no textbook could ever teach. Jayne Mansfield, the bombshell of contradictions. Jayne Mansfield wasn't just a Hollywood bombshell, She was a paradox wrapped in pink satin. To the world, she was the ultimate dumb blonde, a caricature of innocence and allure. But behind that carefully crafted image lay a woman both brilliant and baffling, capable of quoting philosophy one moment and making jaw-dropping mistakes the next. She was the strangest combination of intelligence and ignorance I've ever encountered, one director confessed. Mansfield claimed she spoke 5 languages and boasted an IQ of 163. Yet in the same breath, she might ask if the sun and moon were simply the same object seen at different times of day. Unlike many who leaned entirely on image, Jayne had some genuine schooling at Southern Methodist University and UCLA. She could drop names from Nietzsche to Shakespeare in casual conversation, but dig deeper, and it became clear she'd memorized the quotes without grasping their meaning. One screenwriter recalled, she once attributed a Nietzsche line to Betty Boop, and she wasn't joking. Her grasp of science was just as shaky. A makeup artist remembered Mansfield asking if drinking hydrogen peroxide would turn her organs blonde. When warned it could kill her, she seemed genuinely shocked, and casually mentioned she had already tried just a little the week before. What made Jayne so hard to pin down was her deliberate embrace of the dumb blonde persona. She understood the publicity power of playing naive, and sometimes exaggerated her confusion to grab headlines. But as one publicist admitted, she blurred the lines so much between the act and herself that even she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Financially, her brilliance dimmed even further. Despite commanding huge paychecks, she never seemed to understand money. Her business manager revealed she couldn't distinguish gross from net income. Jayne would get $50,000, immediately spend $75,000, and then be honestly bewildered when she ended up broke. Jayne Mansfield was dazzling, maddening, and unforgettable, a woman who proved that even the brightest spotlight can cast the deepest shadows. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi, the face of horror. Hollywood's eternal outsider. He gave the world one of cinema's most unforgettable monsters, Count Dracula, breathing into the role an aristocratic menace and eerie sophistication that made audiences shiver. On screen, he looked like a genius of the dark arts. Off-screen, however, the truth was far more tragic. Directors who worked with Lugosi in the 1940s recalled that his struggles went far deeper than broken English. Even when scripts were translated into Hungarian, he had trouble grasping basic storylines. You had to explain things to him the way you'd explain them to a child, one director said. His English barely improved despite decades in America. Often, he memorized dialogue phonetically, delivering it with that mesmerizing voice, yet he had no idea what his character was actually saying. A sound technician at Universal remembered, he could recite the lines perfectly, but if you asked him to explain the meaning, he'd stare at you completely lost. What made Lugosi's case even more haunting was that his confusion went beyond language. A producer recalled a maddening moment. We spent 3 hours trying to explain that his character couldn't appear after he died. He kept insisting, "But I am Dracula. Dracula cannot die." To him, the line between himself and his role had blurred into delusion. His lack of understanding spilled into his finances. Lugosi once signed away all rights to his image for a flat $1,000. When the merchandise later made millions, he couldn't comprehend why he wasn't being paid more, even after endless explanations of one-time payment. His superstitions added another layer of tragedy. A makeup artist remembered him refusing to film because furniture had been placed in what he believed was a death pattern. Move a single chair, and suddenly he felt safe. Brilliant as a villain, powerless as a man, Bela Lugosi was swallowed by an industry he could never fully understand. Unable to adapt, he drifted into poverty and ended his career working with Ed Wood on films that critics now call some of the worst ever made. The man who embodied one of cinema's most intelligent monsters spent his final years as a lost soul in Hollywood, a chilling reminder that the scariest stories often happen behind the camera. George Raft, the gangster who couldn't follow the script. George Raft was Hollywood's ultimate tough guy, the streetwise actor who gave gangster films their raw, authentic edge. On screen, he looked every bit the mobster, cold, sharp, and dangerous. But off-screen, George had a secret that became one of Hollywood's most whispered legends. He simply couldn't follow the plot. George couldn't understand the scripts, a Warner Brothers director once admitted. And I don't mean the deeper themes. I mean he literally couldn't keep track of what was happening from scene to scene. Before shooting, Directors would break down each moment for him as if he were hearing the story for the very first time. Born and raised in Hell's Kitchen, Raft left school early. While many actors of his era did the same, Raft never developed the wit or literacy to make up for it. A screenwriter revealed that he was, in truth, almost illiterate. He could recognize his own character's name and a handful of common words, but the rest had to be read aloud to him by assistants. He learned his dialogue through sheer repetition, not by reading. This made film sets a constant challenge. "We'd schedule extra rehearsals just for Raft," one producer recalled. If a line was changed, even one word, he had to relearn the entire scene from scratch. His struggles weren't just with words, but with concepts. During the filming of Background to Danger in 1943, Raft couldn't grasp that his character was a double agent. "So which side am I on again?" he finally asked after an hour of explanations. The crew eventually rewrote his role to keep it simple. Raft's greatest blunder came when he rejected the lead role in The Maltese Falcon. Humphrey Bogart stepped in, turning the film into one of cinema's greatest classics. Publicly, Raft insisted he turned it down because he didn't want to play another gangster. Privately, studio insiders revealed the truth. He simply couldn't understand the story, no matter how many times it was explained. Yet, despite these setbacks, George Raft carved out a remarkable career. He leaned into what he did best, playing straight-shooting gangsters with minimal dialogue and maximum presence. Unlike others who stretched beyond their limits, Raft knew his weaknesses and stayed in his lane. And in doing so, he became an unlikely legend, the illiterate tough guy who, against all odds, outsmarted Hollywood by just being himself. Lana Turner, the sweater girl with unraveled logic. Lana Turner's story is the kind Hollywood was built on. A young girl plucked from obscurity at a soda fountain, transformed overnight into one of the most glamorous icons of the silver screen. With her platinum blonde hair, flawless figure, and undeniable allure, she became the quintessential sex symbol of the 1940s. But behind that shimmering image of sophistication was a startling truth. Lana often struggled with even the simplest ideas, a fact that left colleagues baffled and directors exasperated. One director recalled spending hours trying to explain why her character might be devastated by a husband's affair. Lana, genuinely puzzled, kept asking, "But why would she care what he does when she's not around?" It wasn't rebellion, nor was it modern thinking. She simply could not grasp the concept of emotional betrayal. Her lack of formal education was no secret. Discovered at just 16, she was swept into the MGM machine with no real schooling to prepare her. The studio, recognizing both her brilliance on camera and her off-camera limitations, quietly assigned her a secretary to handle basic tasks: reading, writing, even simple arithmetic. Scripts had to be color-coded and simplified, with long words swapped out for shorter ones. Still, Lana often stumbled over the simplest of lines. Her world knowledge was just as shaky. During the filming of The Postman Always Rings Twice, she famously asked if Acapulco was in Italy. When told it was in Mexico, she wondered aloud if she could drive there from California for the weekend, apparently unaware of geography, distance, or international borders. Money was another blind spot. Despite earning astronomical sums, Lana had little understanding of contracts or finances. A business manager once explained her $5,000 a week salary, only to have her brighten and ask, "So that means I get $5,000 every single day?" Misunderstandings like these fueled a lifetime of reckless spending, bad investments, and chronic money problems, even when she was among the highest-paid women in Hollywood. And yet, what Lana lacked in intellect, she made up for with sheer screen magic. Directors appreciated her willingness to be guided. She didn't argue, didn't resist, she did exactly what was asked. As one cinematographer put it, Lana might not have understood why her character was crying, but she could cry on cue, and look heartbreakingly beautiful doing it. In the end, that was enough. Lana Turner may not have been a scholar, but on screen she radiated the kind of beauty, vulnerability, and glamour that audiences couldn't resist. And in Hollywood, sometimes that was all it took to become a legend. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney, the Hollywood star who could never quite grasp reality. His career stretched across an incredible 9 decades, from child prodigy to elder statesman of the silver screen. In the late 1930s, his boundless energy in the Andy Hardy series and dazzling musicals with Judy Garland made him the nation's #1 box office draw 3 years in a row. But behind that raw talent and boyish charm was a mind often detached from the real world. He lived in a fantasy of his own making, recalled one director from the 1950s. Rooney wasn't simply egotistical. He truly seemed unable to separate fact from whatever story he wanted to believe. If you told him something unpleasant, it just didn't register. His gaps in knowledge could be startling. Even after decades in the business, Rooney never understood that films were shot out of sequence. A production manager remembered him, well into his 60s, becoming confused on set when the ending was filmed before the beginning. "How will the audience understand the story if we tell it backward?" he asked, in complete seriousness. Money baffled him just as much. Despite earning millions, he filed for bankruptcy multiple times. His accountant in the 1970s tried explaining that a mortgage had to be paid monthly whether he was working or not. Mickey simply couldn't grasp it. "But if I don't work that month, why would I have to pay?" His lack of understanding went far beyond finances. During a USO tour in the 1940s, Rooney once asked if Germany and Japan were the same country since America was fighting both. When a fellow performer attempted to explain the war's alliances, Mickey grew frustrated, insisting there had to be only one enemy. Anything else was too complicated. And yet, this same man who seemed lost off stage could embody the deepest emotions and the sharpest comic timing when the cameras rolled. Colleagues were stunned by the contrast. One co-star in the 1960s remembered, "Mickey could capture the most complex emotional shift on screen, then step off set and ask which way California was, while standing right there in Los Angeles." Perhaps most telling was his refusal to recognize his career decline. Even in later years, when he was offered only small character parts, Rooney spoke with absolute conviction about imaginary starring vehicles being developed just for him. Casting directors recalled him spinning elaborate tales of meetings with studio heads that had never taken place, roles that had never existed. He wasn't lying, he genuinely believed his fantasies. Despite his shortcomings, Mickey Rooney's natural brilliance and endless energy carried him through one of the longest and most remarkable careers in Hollywood history. But his disconnect from reality also made him one of its most bewildering and difficult stars. Joan Blondell. Joan Blondell, the wisecracking blonde who could out-talk anyone on screen, but couldn't crack the simplest math problem. For 5 decades and over 100 films, Blondell embodied the quick-witted, street-smart working girl who always seemed 2 steps ahead. With her rapid-fire comebacks and sparkling energy, she gave audiences the impression of razor-sharp intelligence. But behind the camera, insiders whispered a very different story. A Warner Brothers director once recalled, "Joan could deliver dialogue that made her sound like the smartest person in the room. But between takes, she'd ask things so basic it would leave us stunned. She once wanted to know if Abraham Lincoln was real or just a character made up for a movie." Blondell had left school early to support her family on the vaudeville circuit, but colleagues insisted her struggles went deeper than missing a classroom education. A script supervisor admitted, Joan couldn't read an analog clock. Even in her 40s, she'd ask others for the time rather than look at the wall clock herself. Her math skills were just as shaky. Despite earning thousands during her peak, she couldn't subtract change. If something cost 75 cents and she handed over $1, she waited for someone else to point out she was owed a quarter. These weaknesses seeped into business. When she signed a 7-year Warner Brothers contract, Blondell believed it was only for 3. She was genuinely shocked when the studio renewed it for the 4th year, insisting there had been some kind of mistake. Yet, what she lacked in book smarts, Blondell made up for in other ways. Her memory was extraordinary. She never forgot a line of dialogue, and she used that same gift to create clever workarounds, memorizing the look of bills, memorizing clock face positions, anything to mask her gaps. As she grew older, though, directors had to simplify things for her. One remembered telling her during a 1960s TV drama, "Your character is sad because her friend died." To which she sincerely asked, "But why would that make someone sad?" It wasn't cruelty, she just needed emotion spelled out in plainest terms. And yet, Joan Blondell's career thrived. Why? Because her charisma, humor, and natural energy shone so brightly that audiences never noticed what she didn't know. In fact, her limitations perfectly matched the brassy, street-smart roles she was born to play. As one producer said, she wasn't book smart, but she was real, and that's what Hollywood needed. Sometimes in Hollywood, what looks like a weakness can become the very thing that makes you unforgettable. Mae West. Mae West, the sex symbol who knew everything about seduction, but little about the world beyond the bedroom. She built her legendary career on innuendo, razor-sharp one-liners, and a confidence that was decades ahead of its time. Writing many of her own scripts, West dazzled audiences with double entendres and quick retorts that hinted at brilliance. But behind the glittering facade was a woman whose knowledge was surprisingly narrow. She knew everything about sex appeal and virtually nothing about anything else, one director recalled. West could craft dialogue that left censors scrambling, yet stumble when asked who the vice president was or where Europe was on a map. She'd deflect with a sly grin and a joke that turned ignorance into charm. Her education ended at 12, when she left school for vaudeville. Colleagues said it wasn't just a lack of schooling. Abstract ideas seemed to slip through her fingers. On set, she once balked at small talk about politics, asking, "Why would anyone care about things that don't help you get a man?" Geography was worse. During My Little Chickadee, she reportedly asked if Chicago was west of California, and when told it was east, wondered if that made it close to London. Still, her creative genius in her chosen domain was undeniable. West could spin dazzling wordplay, navigating strict censorship codes with ease, and she had a shrewd instinct for contracts, though she never trusted banks, preferring to keep cash stashed in her apartment. Broader economics, history, or science? Forget it. When someone mentioned the Great Depression, she thought they were talking about a mood disorder. Mae West was a paradox, dazzlingly clever in matters of desire, yet stunningly unaware in almost every other subject. But she made that narrow brilliance work. By writing roles tailored to her strengths and doubling down on her persona, she created a world where she was always the center, and audiences were more than happy to live in it, if only for a couple of hours at a time.